The wind howled through the empty streets of Winterside, a small town tucked away in the freezing hills of the north. The kind of cold that cuts through to your bones, where every breath you take feels like inhaling shards of ice. It's here, in the dead of winter, that this story begins. A story that starts with one man shivering on the cold concrete, face pressed against the freezing ground, struggling to complete a set of push-ups. The air is thick with tension as the camera zooms in on his strained face, beads of sweat mingling with the frost. His breath comes in ragged gasps as two officers loom over him, their eyes cold and merciless. One cop grins, clearly enjoying the power, while the other, Officer Pierce, hesitates, his brow furrowed with doubt. "Keep going or we'll add 10 more, the first cop snaps, his voice rough, almost gleeful. The man, eyes narrowing with fury, pushes up again, his muscles screaming in protest, but his spirit unbroken. He's being punished for something that wasn't his fault, and every movement he makes serves to fuel a fire burning deep within him. But there's more to this than meets the eye. This isn't just about push-ups. It's about a fight for justice, a battle for dignity in a town that has long turned a blind eye to corruption. A man in freezing weather, forced to do push-ups by two corrupt cops. The cruel punishment didn't break him, but it ignited a fire that would lead to a confrontation that no one saw coming. This man, he's about to show them that not all heroes wear capes, and not all fights are won with fists. Sometimes, revenge is a dish best served cold. As the cop's voice booms, the cold concrete beneath the man's hands feels like an open grave, and with every push-up, he digs deeper into his resolve. His name? Jake Donovan. The Iron Fist Jake, a former military man with a troubled past, dragged into this nightmare because he'd witnessed something no one else dared speak of. But no one knows that yet. What started as a seemingly random interaction would spiral into a violent and calculated revenge, set in motion by one man's willingness to face his worst fears, and perhaps even his own limits. The second officer reads, shifts uneasily. His eyes flick between Jake and his partner, who cracks his knuckles, savoring every moment. The tension between the cops is palpable. One is clearly enjoying the abuse of power, the other is silently battling his own moral compass. But Jake? He's pushing through the agony, a man with nothing left to lose. What happens next will leave everyone in Winterside stunned, because Jake Donovan isn't just going to take this. He's about to make them all regret ever crossing him. The moment fades from the dark, snow-covered alley to a flashback scene of a military base, a harsh desert landscape bathed in sunlight. We see a young man in combat gear, his face hardened by the years spent in the trenches. His name? Jake Donovan. The sounds of soldiers shouting orders and the rhythmic pounding of boots against the earth mix with the distant roar of engines and the occasional gunshot. Flash after flash, the camera reveals Jake's brutal training, long hours spent running obstacle courses, hand-to-hand combat, and countless nights spent keeping watch, eyes scanning the horizon for danger. These moments are interspersed with darker memories, faces of friends lost in battle, their bodies left behind in foreign soil, their names carved on a memorial that Jake visits in secret. Narration. Jake Donovan had seen the worst of humanity, the kind of training that breaks men, the kind of loss that leaves a scar deeper than any wound. He'd fought for his country, only to return home to find that the war didn't end when the battlefields did. In the eyes of the system, he was just another number, another forgotten soldier. The flashes blur together, his past an unspoken weight upon his shoulders. We see Jake's face, cold, focused, but weary, looking down at a picture of his comrades, each one a casualty of war, and a system that never seemed to care. Yet one thing remains constant in his mind: Jake's determination. He may have lost many battles, but he was never going to lose the war against the injustices in his life. Military training had given Jake the strength to endure physical pain, but it was the betrayal, the broken promises from the very people he served to protect, that had hardened him the most. When the system failed him, Jake vowed he would never back down again. Not from anyone. Not even from the ones with badges. The event cuts to a quiet, dimly lit room in a small police station. A pile of paperwork sits on the desk, as the low hum of a television is heard in the background. Officer Mark Miller sits in a worn-out chair, his feet propped up on the table, a smirk playing on his face. He flips through pages in a folder, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous sort of amusement. Miller is the embodiment of power gone unchecked. He's the cop who knows he can get away with anything, the kind of man who will always bend the law to suit his whims. Next to him, Officer Reed stands by the window, looking out into the snowy streets, his face grim. Reed is younger, more impressionable. Though he doesn't enjoy the power trips, he's learned to keep his head down and follow orders. He's a man conflicted between right and wrong, but ultimately he's the one who's too afraid to do what's necessary. Miller notices this hesitation and takes advantage of it, using Reed's uncertainty to his advantage. Miller and Reed were a pair of officers who'd long since learned how to operate under the radar. Miller, the older, more experienced one, was a man who took pleasure in using his badge as a weapon. His authority was a joke, but to him, it was his right. Reed, on the other hand, was less sure of himself. He'd seen Miller cross lines before, but he always looked the other way, telling himself it was just part of the job. Reed looks uncomfortable as he glances at the report in front of him, his hand lingering near his radio as if he's waiting for something or someone to intervene. But he's stuck in a cycle of moral ambiguity, unwilling to challenge his partner's actions. Miller, noticing Reed's discomfort, cracks a cynical smile. For Miller, it was a game, a twisted dance of control and intimidation. He'd made his way to the top by breaking rules and bending the law. He knew no one would stop him, not as long as he kept things under wraps. But tonight, he was going to meet someone who was no longer afraid of him. Someone who knew how to break back. Back in the present, Jake struggles with every push-up, his muscles screaming as the cold freezes his skin. But something deeper stirs inside him. This isn't just a punishment anymore. It's the beginning of something bigger. Be bind, education! As he looks up at the cops, the anger in his eyes shifts to something else. A quiet realization. He knows who they are. Cut to Jake flipping through a worn notebook. He's tracking the corrupt officers. They may think they're untouchable, but Jake has spent years preparing for a moment like this. As a former soldier, he knew how to gather intel, how to fight when the odds were stacked against him. Miller and Reed had made their mistakes long before they crossed paths with Jake Donovan. Their crimes weren't just about abusing power. They had a history. In the weeks before the fateful incident in the alley, Jake had uncovered dark secrets about Miller and Reed, their involvement in bribery, corruption, and even cover-ups that left innocent civilians at the mercy of criminals. But the deeper he dug, the more he realized just how far these two were willing to go to keep their dirty little secrets buried. Jake, a man hardened by war and betrayal, and the two corrupt cops, Miller and Reed, who are used to manipulating the system to their advantage. The setup creates a sense of looming justice as Jake prepares to turn the tables on the men who think they control the law. The stage is set for revenge, and with it, an unpredictable series of events that will test the limits of justice, morality, and what happens when the people who are meant to protect others fall from grace. The alley is a desolate place. Snowflakes swirl through the air, settling on the hardened ground, but the chill is no match for the rage building inside Jake Donovan. His body is frozen, aching from the relentless push-ups, but it's the humiliation and anger boiling beneath his skin that truly burns. Each push-up is more than just a physical challenge. It's a test of endurance against two men who see him as nothing more than a plaything. Miller, the older, ruthless cop, paces back and forth, arms crossed, enjoying every second of Jake's suffering. "You're not going to stop until I say so," Miller growls, his words laced with malice. Reed, his younger partner, stands off to the side, eyes darting between Jake and Miller. There's a hesitation in Reed's posture, a sense of unease, but he says nothing. Then, without warning, Miller steps forward. A sneer twists across his face as he delivers a brutal kick to Jake's ribs, sending him crashing onto the frozen pavement. The sound of Jake's body hitting the concrete echoes through the alley, and for a split second, everything goes still. As the icy wind howled, Jake's anger grew. He wasn't going to let them break him, but when Miller kicked him to the ground, something inside him snapped. It wasn't just the pain. It was the realization that he'd been pushed too far. They had no idea who they were messing with. Jake's breath comes in short, sharp gasps as he looks up from the cold ground, eyes blazing with fury. He doesn't stay down for long. The harsh, biting wind may have numbed his limbs, but it hadn't yet frozen his will to fight. With a primal growl, Jake pushes himself back onto his feet, fury radiating from his every move. He cuts to Miller's smug face as he steps closer, expecting Jake to stay down, but what he doesn't expect is the ferocity that bursts from Jake. Without warning, Jake lunges at Miller, fists flying in a blur of motion. The sound of Jake's knuckles colliding with Miller's jaw rings through the alley like a thunderclap, and Miller stumbles back in shock. Reed, trying to maintain some semblance of control, steps forward with a shaky hand on his taser, but he's too slow. Jake sidesteps Reed with the precision of a seasoned fighter. A quick, brutal elbow to Reed's temple sends him to the ground, unconscious before he even realizes what hit him. It's clear Jake is no ordinary man. His military training is evident in the fluidity of his strikes, the way he anticipates every move, and the way he turns the fight into a brutal ballet of controlled violence. The vision is tight, capturing every punch and kick, each one landing with sickening impact. Miller, stunned by the sudden turn of events, tries to regain his balance, but Jake is relentless. He grabs Miller by the collar, his fingers tightening around the fabric as he lifts him off the ground with ease. The snow seems to stop falling, the world narrowing down to the two men, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Jake's voice is a low, dangerous growl. "You'll regret this," he says, his words heavy with meaning. His grip tightens, and for a moment, the air feels electric, the fight teetering on the edge of something darker. Miller can barely speak, his breath shallow, eyes wide in disbelief. He knows he's outmatched, but he's too proud to show it. Slowly, Jake lets him drop to the ground. Miller crumples, dazed, but Jake doesn't spare him another glance. The fight is over, and Jake has won. The event lingers for a moment on the defeated officers. Reed is out cold, Miller groaning in the snow, too stunned to get up. Jake stands over them, victorious, his chest heaving from exertion, his face still hard as stone. Thai streets had never seen anything like this. Jake fought back with the fury of someone who had been pushed too far. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity, he was fighting for something bigger. And the cops? They realized too late that they had chosen the wrong man to mess with. Jake takes a final, lingering look at the two officers, his eyes cold and filled with purpose. He doesn't say another word, but the message is clear. This isn't the end. This is just the beginning. He turns and walks away, his footsteps crunching in the snow as the camera follows him. The cops are left behind, stunned, defeated, and for the first time, uncertain about their place in this world. As Jake walks away, his silhouette receding into the snowstorm, the camera cuts back to the fallen officers. Miller, nursing his swollen jaw, watches helplessly as Jake disappears into the distance. He can't believe it. This was supposed to be an easy victory. Miller grits his teeth, rage building. "We're not done, Donovan," he mutters, his voice barely above a whisper. But it's too late. The damage has already been done. The moment slowly zooms in on Jake's retreating figure, the cold wind biting at his skin, his body bruised but unbroken. The tension lingers, thick in the air. Jake Donovan had made his stand. He had sent a message, a warning. But the fight for justice was far from over. The next move was up to the cops, and they had no idea what was coming for them. The moment fades to black as the heavy sound of Jake's footsteps fades into the distance. The snow continues to fall, covering the evidence of the brutal confrontation, but the question remains, what will happen next? Will the cops seek revenge, or will Jake's actions spark a chain of events that will change Winterside forever? The battle has only just begun. The atmosphere is thick with tension as Jake Donovan takes a step into a new chapter of this battle. No longer a man fighting for his own survival, but a force of justice determined to expose the corruption that lies at the heart of Winterside. With his adrenaline still high from the fight, he moves quickly, his mind razor-sharp. Jake begins by digging into the two officers' pasts, his knowledge of their history, their ties to organized crime, their abuse of power, all of it. Files, documents, photographs. He moves through them like a man possessed, uncovering a trail of corruption so deep that it sickens him. Each file reveals a new layer of deceit and brutality. Miller's connections to underworld figures, Reed's record of violent altercations and abuse of power. The deeper Jake digs, the darker it becomes. The event alternates between Jake meticulously gathering evidence in a dimly lit office and the cops, now on a warpath, preparing to track him down. Miller, still recovering from the brutal beating, stares at a cracked mirror, his face twisted with rage. He picks up his gun with a cold determination. Reed, standing next to him, watches the shift in his partner's demeanor, the fear in his eyes, palpable. Together they make their way into the cold streets, ready for revenge. Jake knew their past. He had uncovered their trail of corruption, and now he was going to turn the tables. They had humiliated him, but he had something they didn't. Knowledge. And that knowledge was his weapon. Jake now going through the cluttered files, the camera zooms in on certain documents, the photographs of shady meetings, records of illicit deals, and even a few bloodied, hidden receipts from underground criminal activities. The weight of the evidence is overwhelming, and Jake knows that what he holds in his hands could destroy Miller and Reed forever. The harsh fluorescent lights flicker above Jake as he flips through the files. The file lingers on his hands, shaking slightly from the cold, as his eyes scan each document with growing intensity. His breath is visible in the air, but it's the fire in his eyes that keeps the viewers glued to the screen. On the other hand, Miller, his face a portrait of simmering anger as he suits up, putting on a bulletproof vest and sliding his gun into the holster. He adjusts his jacket, a man ready for war. His reflection in the mirror is broken, symbolizing his fractured psyche. Reed, in contrast, is hesitant. He watches Miller, the nerves evident in his movements, but there's an undercurrent of fear in his actions, the sound of his boots on the cold pavement echoing in the empty precinct. The sound of paper rustling fills the scene as Jake flips through files. Each page turning represents a new revelation, a new strike against the two officers. The distant hum of police sirens grows louder as Miller and Reed head out to find Jake, their pursuit relentless. Each siren is a reminder that the chase is on, that the stakes are rising higher with each passing moment. The wind howls through the alleyways, cold and biting, echoing the impending storm. This sound blends with the eerie quiet of the night, amplifying the sense of impending danger. It's a reminder that Jake isn't just up against two corrupt cops, he's up against the entire system. The sharp clicks of Miller's gun being cocked, followed by the echo of his footsteps, reflect his growing impatience and rage. The contrast between Jake's methodical investigation and the cops' frantic preparation adds to the mounting tension. We see Jake at the computer, typing fast, pulling up digital records of bribes, extortion, and drug deals, while the sound of distant footsteps and muffled radio chatter in the background hints at the impending pursuit. Jake wasn't just out for revenge. He was on a mission to bring justice to Winterside. He had the truth on his side, and he was going to expose it, no matter the cost. But Miller and Reed had other plans. They didn't know yet, but the tables were about to turn. Jake's fight had only just begun. As Jake gets the last of the evidence he needs, the camera zoom pans across a city map, his finger tracing the route he's about to take, moving from the police department to the shady warehouses on the outskirts of Winterside, where Miller and Reed have hidden their ill-gotten gains. The chase begins. Miller and Reed, now in full pursuit mode, speed down snow-covered streets, their vehicle a hulking presence against the backdrop of a frozen city. The sound of tires screeching and engines roaring cuts through the tension, a stark contrast to the slow, methodical steps Jake takes as he walks the streets. The two parties are closing in on each other. The moment moves quickly, shifting from Jake's eyes, focused and unyielding, to Miller, gripping the wheel tightly, his breath heavy with anticipation. Reed, eyes darting nervously, keeps glancing out the window, as if the city itself holds a threat. A tight chase had begun, and in the streets of Winterside, there was no place to hide. Jake was outnumbered, but he wasn't afraid. He knew every corner of this city, every alley, every shortcut, and he was about to use that knowledge to his advantage. Cut to Jake, now several steps ahead, slipping into the shadows of a dark alley, the only light coming from the distant glow of street lamps. He crouches behind a stack of crates, watching as the police car pulls up, its headlights cutting through the darkness like an oncoming storm. The sound of the engine shutting off and the crunch of snow underfoot echoes in the alley. The tension is unbearable. The camera zooms in on Jake's face, determined, unyielding. He pulls out a small, sleek gun from his jacket, the cold steel reflecting the faint streetlight. He takes one deep breath, adjusting the grip. The battle lines have been drawn, and there is no turning back. Time had come. Jake had the upper hand. He had the truth. And now, he had the chance to strike. Miller and Reed thought they could intimidate him into silence, but tonight they would learn that the truth had a voice, and that voice was Jake Donovan. As Jake prepares for the final confrontation, the sound of distant footsteps becomes louder, drawing closer. The screen fades to black, the air charged with anticipation. The final showdown is on the horizon. The story takes a dark and twisted turn as Jake's investigation uncovers the extent of Miller and Reed's corruption. In a cluttered apartment lit only by the dim glow of a desk lamp, Jake reviews the pile of documents he's managed to gather. Each piece of evidence is a puzzle piece falling into place. A trail of illegal activities, organized crime, and the abuse of power that goes beyond what Jake could have ever imagined. A moment pans over a series of disturbing photographs and images of Miller and Reed in compromising positions, with criminals, bribe payments, and bloody civilian encounters. In these photos, Jake sees their true faces, not the officers they portray to the public, but the monsters they really are. Jake's blood boils as he goes through each file, his eyes narrowing in disbelief as the scope of their cruelty is revealed. What seemed like a simple abuse of power was just the tip of the iceberg. As Jake dug deeper, he uncovered a history of brutality and corruption. From extortion to physical abuse of civilians, these cops had left a trail of destruction. And now, Jake was about to make sure they couldn't hide anymore. Jake pulls up a file titled The Winterside Incident. It's a chilling account of an unsolved case where a young woman, assaulted and left for dead, was silenced by a cover-up orchestrated by the very officers tasked with protecting her. Jake's fists clench as he flips through the details, his mind working over the horrible injustice of it all. He realizes the magnitude of what he's up against. It's not just a personal vendetta, it's a mission to expose the rot at the core of the Winterside Police Department. With this newfound knowledge, Jake decides it's time to face Miller and Reed head-on. He knows they won't come quietly, so he takes the most dangerous route, luring them into an abandoned building on the edge of Winterside, a decaying warehouse that holds the dark secrets of the city. The streets are silent, and the night is thick with fog. As Jake enters the building, the creaking of rusted metal echoing in the void. He had them right where he wanted them, cornered, vulnerable. But Jake wasn't after vengeance alone. No, he wanted to bring them to justice, and in this decaying place, he would make sure their sins would be exposed for the world to see. Jake stands in the heart of the abandoned warehouse, a cold wind sweeping through the broken windows. His breath condenses in the freezing air, his eyes locked on the shadows as Miller and Reed enter, guns drawn. The tension in the room is palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Miller, furious, eyes burning with rage, glares at Jake as he steps forward, his voice seething with authority. "Miller, you think you've won, Donovan? You think you can take us down? I've buried men like you before." Reed, looking more nervous than ever, lingers in the background, his gun shaking in his hands. He's not sure if he wants to be part of this anymore, but Miller has already made it clear there's no turning back now. Reed stays silent, watching his partner, his conscience gnawing at him. Miller thought he had control, but Jake wasn't intimidated. The odds might have been against him, but he wasn't going to back down, not when the stakes were this high. This wasn't about a badge or a gun. This was about standing up to the tyranny of men who thought they could act with impunity. Jake was steady and calm. He slowly raises his fists, ready for the fight. He knows Miller is itching to pull the trigger, but Jake is faster. Before Miller can make his move, Jake takes a step forward and, with precision, disarms him in a flash of action. A flurry of blows follows. Jake's military combat skills are on full display as he lands punch after punch. Miller's face twists with fury, but he's no match for Jake's speed and precision. Reed, hesitant and unsure, attempts to intervene, but is quickly knocked out by a brutal kick to the side. The vision spins in quick, disorienting cuts as the fight escalates. The sound of fists connecting with flesh fills the air, the crack of bones reverberating through the room as Jake overpowers Miller. Miller's gun skitters across the floor, but Jake doesn't waste a second. He dives on Miller, pulling him to the ground, the two rolling in a vicious struggle. Miller's face eyes wide with panic as Jake lifts him by the collar and slams him against the wall. Jake's growling voice echoed cold. "You'll regret this, Miller. You've crossed the wrong man." It wasn't just about winning. It was about delivering a message. Miller had used his badge to hurt innocent people. But now, it was his turn to face the consequences. As Miller gasps for air, Jake steps back, preparing to deal the final blow. But before he can, Miller scrambles to his feet, trying to flee the scene, panic overtaking his usual bravado. Jake isn't done yet. He grabs Miller by the arm, pulling him back into the cold reality of the abandoned warehouse. This fight was only part of the plan. Now, it's time to expose the truth. Jake pulls out a small hidden camera, setting it up in the dim light, pointing it at Miller. "Miller, Promector? You think the police will believe you? You think anyone will listen to you? I'll destroy you, Donovan." Jake. Calm. "Talk all you want, the world's about to hear the truth." As Miller stares into the camera, Jake demands that he confess his crimes. The brutal cover-ups, the abuse, the bribes, and the numerous innocent lives ruined. Miller's facade cracks, and his voice shakes as he begins to spill his secrets, exposing everything he and Reed had been hiding. Jake had turned the tables. The corrupt cop who thought he could intimidate others into silence was now the one begging for mercy. But Jake wasn't offering any. The truth would come out, and Miller would face the consequences of his sins. The vision zooms in on Miller's face as he confesses everything, his own guilt and the crimes he thought he could escape. Jake leaves him to the police, making sure that the evidence will be heard. Jake's camera clicks as it records the confession, the sound of Jake's breath steady in the silence. Police sirens wail in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup. The tension lifts slightly, but the weight of Miller's confession hangs heavy in the air. The final, cold exhale from Jake as he leaves Miller to face his fate. In the end, Jake had done what no one else dared to. He had faced the monster head-on and made sure the world knew what it had done. The justice system had failed, Winter sighed. But Jake Donovan, a man with nothing left to lose, had brought it to its knees. As Jake walks away, the camera lingers on his back. He may not have been a hero in the traditional sense, but in that moment, he had become a symbol of retribution. Jake didn't just win the battle, he exposed the truth. In the end, it wasn't about revenge. It was about righting the wrongs. The camera zooms in on Jake's face as he walks, the intensity of the events reflected in his cold expression. His breath condenses in the frozen air, his step steady as he moves away from the scene. There's no celebration, no sense of victory, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth has finally been revealed. His fight was never about him, it was about every innocent life these men had ruined. As Jake disappears into the night, Miller was escorted by officers, his hands cuffed, the weight of his confession now his cross to bear. Reed, similarly handcuffed, avoids eye contact, his role in the entire scheme now clear for the world to see. If you were in Jake's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have exposed the truth, or would you have let the system continue its injustice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how you'd handle the situation. Would you take the fight to the system, or walk away from the pain? If you want more stories of justice and retribution, stories where the line between right and wrong gets blurred and the consequences of the truth come crashing down, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our series.